The information shared in this podcast and related media is intended to provide broad consumer understanding and knowledge of healthcare topics as they pertain to remote work. All content herein is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Further, this information should not be used in place of a visit, call, consultation, or advice of your physician or other healthcare provider. The owners of this content do not recommend the self-management of health problems. Should you have any healthcare-related questions, please call or see your physician or other healthcare provider promptly. You should never disregard medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen or heard on this podcast or read in related media. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor, seek professional help, or call 911 immediately.
Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast Mental Health Series. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. The purpose of this series is to destigmatize the mental health issues commonly found in the remote work community. We have partnered with doctors, therapists, counselors, and other mental health professionals for a series of in-depth discussions on a broad range of topics, ranging from isolation and depression to crafting meaningful relationships with others, and maybe more importantly, with ourselves. Our guest experts will share their insights in order to arm teams and leaders with the tools they need to thrive now and in the future. Mental health has always been a relevant issue for remote workers, freelancers, and distributed teams. But in today's climate, the subject is becoming more and more pertinent each and every day. I look forward to sharing this valuable information with you, and please join the conversation online, on the socials, or wherever the audience most suited to hear it can get involved. Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by TeamMadeApart.com. Team Made Apart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker, Team Made Apart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammadeapart.com/crisis to not only download your free Team Made Apart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammadeapart.com/crisis, that is teammadeapart.com/crisis, to download your free Best Practices Guide. This week's special guest is Michelle E. Dickinson. Michelle is a passionate mental health advocate, a TED speaker, and a published author of a memoir entitled Breaking Into My Life. After years of playing the child caregiver, Michelle embarked on her own healing journey of self-discovery and has since gone on to spend years working to eradicate stigma surrounding mental health in the workplace. She does this by elevating compassion, initiating more open conversations, and fostering impactful change regarding how mental illness is understood at work. Here to explore all that and more, join me in welcoming our guest, Michelle E. Dickinson. Hey, Michelle, thank you so much for doing the show. I am thrilled to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Ryan. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. I think, and I had the pleasure of talking to you for a couple minutes prior to recording, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to just have people like you, mental health experts, coming in and willing to share their knowledge about this stuff, because I think it's something that is often overlooked in remote work, and I think it's really critical in remote work. And so I'm really grateful for your time, and thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here to tell you, what I have to share, because I think it's real, even more so now that in light of COVID, mental well-being is a really important topic.
I think it's true. And it's one of these things that I feel like gets paid lip service a lot. People often say, oh, well, yeah, mental health. But I don't feel like we always commit to it, and I feel like it's maybe it's an education thing. Maybe people don't realize how to better commit, that sort of thing. So hopefully we can get to the bottom of some of that.
Yeah.
But before we get started or get too deep, let's talk a little bit about you and just understand who you are, where you've come from, what your expertise is, that sort of thing.
Sure, sure. So I have about 19 years in the pharmaceutical industry. I just completed that long duration working at some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in New Jersey. I also grew up with a mother who had bipolar disorder. So found myself giving a TED talk about that experience. And then I went on to write a memoir with the hopes that I could humanize mental health and we could engage in more open dialogue around mental health. So we could just eradicate the stigma, because the stigma is what prevents so many people from reaching out and getting the care that they deserve. Last year, my position in the big pharma world was eliminated, and I had this opportunity to kind of finally go for my dreams, and that was create my own mental health company so that I could help cultures in the workplace be more compassionate and understanding and supportive for people with invisible disabilities. I spent the last several years of my pharma career creating a stigma-free workplace. So I have a lot of really great ideas and ways companies can go about doing that. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome. Well, I think that really makes you a perfect fit. I'm really anxious to see what you think about some of these things, because as we were just talking about, I mean, cultural shifts are so critical. And because of this whole COVID-19 thing, all of a sudden everybody was put into a situation where we had to completely rethink the way we do business. And for many, they leapt into new situations, almost kind of like a Band-Aid approach, assuming this would be a short-term change. But I think what we're finding is that what we think of as a new normal might be a completely new normal. Like we may not just be going back to the office the way that we once did. Yep. And so I think it's really important that we start to explore that stuff. So let's talk a little bit about, so you mentioned, the growing up and taking care of your mother with bipolar disorder. I think that this is one perspective that doesn't get touched on a lot, or at least not in my experience, is the idea of the person who's the caregiver. Yeah. And so maybe talk a little bit about your experience and what that did for you, and, as it sort of manifests itself later in the memoir.
Sure. Yeah. I didn't know any different. My mom had bipolar disorder from when I was a very, very little girl. She had the traditional signs of mania and then deep depression. And so my father worked. He was primary care, provider for our family. So I really took on the role of caring for my mom, especially when she was, just too fragile to be left alone, but not sick enough to be hospitalized. So I cared for her during that time, and it actually taught me a lot. It actually, I had an entirely different perspective on mental illness, because I witnessed her pain and then I witnessed her joy in such, drastic periods. So I think that taught me a lot about, when your loved one is going through something, there's only so much you can do. And it's just so easy to get lost in their illness and not live your life. So I learned a lot about that. It also taught me a lot of compassion and understanding, like deep compassion and understanding, and to not fear someone with a mental illness, because they're just, they're just dealing with a brain imbalance. It's not something, we make it so big, and it's really like, why can't we just have more compassion for people that have a mental illness and really extend ourselves and help them without this fear that they're going to infect us or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because you don't treat somebody with a broken bone that way, for example. Mm-hmm. You're not afraid that by shaking their hand or whatever, you're going to somehow end up with a broken arm, and so, but there is sort of this built-in fear or trepidation or something around mental health, and, regardless of what it is or how extreme it is. And so I think it was, the words you used that I really liked was compassion. I typically think of it as empathy, but I think it's kind of saying the same thing, in that people need to take the time and really think about those they're working for. And I think as it pertains to corporate culture, this is maybe a great place to talk about that a little bit and developing this compassion. I think that for a long time in society and in workplaces in general, and I'm sure there are plenty of exceptions, so this is a broad generality. But I assume that there were a lot of times when, sort of bottom line things, just trying to make sure that, you were profitable, or that you met stakeholder expectations or whatever. Those kinds of things became the priority for a long time. And as a result, the care of people, or putting people first, sort of started to slip. And maybe we didn't take that much time to really think about, what our, the commodity of our human workforce is. Yeah. And so as we move forward and become more empathetic, and I think we are getting much more progressive, generally speaking, I feel like the bit that is mental health is sort of like maybe the next frontier that we have to break into in sort of corporate culture. We've started to understand people might want to work from home. We've started to understand people will have different things, or maybe they want to bring their dog to work or something, like people will have these fun things that we can do at work nowadays. But I still think we're just a little bit shy or a little remiss when it comes to sort of mental health. And I am seeing some great progress in those spaces, but I wonder what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think, when I think about the companies that I have the fortune to work with, they are more progressive. They understand that when you say diversity and inclusion, you really need to be including people with invisible disabilities, just like you would someone with a physical disability. And you need to be thinking about accommodations that you can make someone with that has a mental illness. Because, if you deal with an employee who has like autism or who needs that space, who can't be around a lot of people, it makes them anxious. Like, it's really about helping employees perform the best of their ability and giving them what they need to do that and allowing them to show up. I love that. And, I think when you think about the flip side of that, by doing nothing, you're basically ignoring an entire population and you're adding stress to them because they're the ones that are putting their game face on and going to work, trying to do the best that they can. And they have an added layer of stress on top of that, trying to conceal that they're struggling with something. So I think we need to train our people leaders to be more compassionate, more empathetic, and we need to start getting curious about each other because we're all human beings and we're all complex human beings and we all have histories and we all have stories. And you're not an employee number, you're a human being before you are an employee number. So, I guess when I think about my own compassion, like I had some compassion for my mother. But when you're at the effects of someone with a mental illness, it's very, very easy for you to get consumed in what the impact of their behavior is on you instead of stopping and getting curious about how is life occurring for them? What are they really dealing with that is having them act like that? That little bit of care, that little bit of compassion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And you've mentioned a couple of times this phrase that I really like, this idea of invisible disabilities. I think when people think of individuals with disabilities, they think of physical problems or maybe severe mental problems. But I don't think they think of things often like, maybe just, mild depression or, some of these things that a person might be working through and having a really hard time. And it may affect their performance at work. But I don't think they're often, called out or extra attention paid to that type of issue. And so I think that's, a space where we can improve. It's interesting, especially in the remote workspace, there's real opportunity for people of all this, levels of disability, invisible or otherwise, to really leverage remote work as a way to, build a situation that works for them. One of the things that comes up a lot among remote work advocates is this misconception that most people fighting for remote work are trying to say that this is the way it must be. Everyone should be working remote. But what most are really advocating for is choice, right? And this choice provides latitude or flexibility for people who have needs. Right. And, one example I've been pointing to recently during this COVID outbreak, my wife is a junior high teacher. She teaches 8th grade honors English. And, she has a lot of kids that are, pretty high performers. But what she found is that her kids that were typically low performers and typically sort of in the sort of ADD, ADHD kind of spectrum, those kids exceeded all her expectations during this time while they were working at home. Wow. And I think, we're of course just speculating, we haven't had the opportunity to sit these kids down and ask them, but our guess is, they were removed from this classroom full of distractions and they were able to focus on something as singular as a computer monitor so they could do their work. And ultimately they were able to rise to that occasion. So for them, what's the motivation to come back to work or back to school in the fall?
Yes.
And just like that exists in the classroom, that type of choice for a person who maybe has a similar affliction or has some other kind of problem where they don't do well, maybe in a large group, or maybe, they require, some sensory isolation or something, those kind of people should be allowed to make choices that help them, navigate their workplace. And I think that remote work is a great place for that.
And but I love that, because imagine a world where we meet people where they are and we give them what they need to do the very best they can. That is truly a win-win for the employees' fulfillment and for the performance of the organization. Meeting employees where they are, giving them what they need to meet or exceed expectations. Like, imagine if we could do something like that and stop making it so cookie cutter. You got to be here at this time, you got to interact with this person. Like, how about some having like a fluid way of working,
Yeah.
And measuring on performance, not on like a factory worker.
Yeah. No, it's so true. And we talk a lot about, I guess I do. I probably beat this concept into the ground a lot, but I talk a lot about intention and just sort of doing things for the right reason, right? And I think that when you're building a distributed company and you're working remotely, a lot of the newer, younger companies are pretty good about this, but older companies that are trying to adapt are often doing so, or I shouldn't say often, but are doing so frequently enough that I notice that they're making the shift to remote because they have to, right? If they want to be competitive or they want somebody to engage with their company or retain an employee or something, they need to kind of offer some level of remote work or be able to work from home on occasion, some kind of flexible arrangement. And but they often, it doesn't seem like are doing it and like they're coming from the right place, right? They've kind of been strong-armed into having to do this, or maybe they see a bottom line where they can save some money on real estate or on, whatever, some kind of function of business, rather than a function of how to make people better. So I think the point you just made about, really making, meeting people where they are and allowing people to be their best version of them, I think you'll get the side products, right? You'll get the benefits of the, increased efficiency, and you'll get all these other things by allowing people to just be themselves. And so even though it might be a little scary, I think that's a good point.
Yeah. And the other thing that I want to mention too, is that the younger generations want an environment, their employer and their environment to be comfortable with mental health conversations, with mental health support. So if you're looking to be a competitive organization, like our younger generations, it's an expectation that mental health be on the table, be discussed, be provided support, whatever that looks like. So you're going to attract talent if you are really doing the right thing for the right reasons and creating a culture that accommodates people of all abilities.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And, if we were going to talk about some of the practical matters of business, statistics indicate that mental health illness is probably among the most expensive illnesses in healthcare. It's one of the things that companies spend the most money on. So, even if they're, not strictly looking out for their employees' best interest, even, considering their own best interest, this is expensive stuff to take care of. And I think it's you, or I think I read in your bio that you mentioned that $1 spent in investing in mental health has a $3 to $5 return. Can you sort of explain how that works?
It's proactive. If you have, so the things that I like to work with my clients to do is create a culture of compassion. There are several different ways that you can go about doing that. But if there is a community, for example, if you have employees who have navigated a mental illness and you've created a culture where they're open and talking about it, and you create like a employee resource group or a peer community, you have employees that are able to tap into the greatest resource you have, and that's your people. And they can see hope in each other. If you've gotten through depression, you came out the other side, you represent hope. So if you could have other employees know that that's a resource, you keep your employee working. You don't lose them if they're dealing with something, because they recognize other employees around them who may have navigated it and been okay. And they then can understand, okay, so what strategies could I do to navigate this? And just knowing that, so-and-so did it and they didn't have to leave work, and they didn't have to go out on disability for X amount of weeks, that they were able to stay working, because it's a very important thing. If you can find a way to have an employee stay engaged and working to whatever capacity, then you're not going to lose them for several weeks on disability. And you keep them motivated to the best of the ability, and then there's, the resource, having great benefits and having tools for employees. One of the greatest things that I loved about my last company was we had a platform like where people were openly telling their stories. Leaders were telling their stories. It humanizes mental health. But when others go first, it makes you feel like, oh my God, I'm not so strange. I'm dealing with that too. Like our CEO had dealt with anxiety and stress and anxiety. Oh my goodness, I was just dealing with that myself. It makes it more real, and then there can be a conversation, and then it becomes less of a thing. And and when I say I need a mental health day, I'm not lying and saying I have a stomach ache. It's just you're creating a culture that really supports employees working.
Well, and I think it normalizes to some effect the fact that we're all human. We all have, working brains that act in certain ways, and, you're not so different than me and all that kind of stuff. And I think you're right that does sort of knock down some of the walls. Mm-hmm. One of the things you mentioned in there too, as you're talking about being able to go to work while, dealing with these problems and having people who are around you who are compassionate, making it easier for you to come to the office or, to work remotely or wherever you may be working. One of the things that I noticed a lot, and especially not to be too anecdotal, just talking about our own kids and everything during this COVID crisis and the homeschooling and all this stuff was, what we found really benefited most of our, my kids, specifically my children, and then also my wife's students, was stability. And I think that this is one of the things that really helps us in mental health. And, we talk about fluidity and movement and being able to work where you are and that kind of thing, but having something regular to check into, like your job, for example, and not having to lose it because you're having a down period or because you're feeling depressed or because you're, having, any array of problems.
Right.
Being able to keep that little bit of stability in your life, I think, can sort of anchor you or give you something to work towards as you're trying to struggle through something. I mean, what do you think of that as a concept?
Yeah, so it's so funny. You're speaking to some of the things that I talk about. Many of my clients asked me to support their people while they were remote. So I've been delivering my resilience webinar. One of the things in my resilience webinar is the importance of structure and physical zones in your home. And that structure, it could be, your structure, it might be different than someone else's, but having a structure where you're getting up in the morning consistently, taking care of yourself, doing what you need to is really important. And when you start losing that structure, things start to get blurry and you start, even when you don't sleep regularly, that is going to impact your well-being. So I talk about the importance of structure and physical zones, having things that you do in certain spaces in your home, like you're not exercising in the relaxation space, like little things. So I believe in that. Absolutely. You have to have structure. Absolutely. Especially for young ones.
Yeah. And for me, like as somebody who's been a remote worker for nearly 20 years now, I understand the importance of that. I get up at the same time every day, shower, brush my teeth, have the same breakfast pretty much. I go down, I read, I do my thing, and I work through these steps each day. Right. And that little bit of stability, almost makes it like I'm going to work, right? Instead of just getting up, putting my PJs on and grabbing the laptop, it's kind of, puts me in the right frame of mind. And I'm sure my kids didn't love it, but as a result of that, we, when school went home, we literally stuck their bell schedule on the wall and we just kept the same bell schedule. And so, I'm sure they didn't love having to adhere to that, and largely, they were done well ahead of the bell schedule most of the time. Mm-hmm. But having that structure and understanding that, okay, at 9 a.m. I'm going to be doing math. And then from that, for them, I think it was really good. And I think as that pertains to remote work, whether you're working from home and you need to have some sort of routine yourself, or, I've even spoken to sort of these digital nomad types that just travel the world and do their thing. Their routine doesn't look at all like my routine, but it's the same, right? Like on Tuesday, they do this and they need this kind of space to work and that kind of thing. So I think that that's a great topic. The
other thing I do want to mention, I'm going to offer this for your listeners because I love this and people love this idea, is refresh your workspace wherever you're sitting. And you may not have had to work from home consistently until this whole COVID thing happened. But if you're finding yourself in like this old space, refresh it, change what you look at, change what you're smelling, and change what you're hearing. So maybe get a diffuser and have some essential oil so that you have good smells. It's just going to help energize you. Maybe listen to soft music, and maybe put up a picture that you love that is like on the shelf over there, but you really should be looking at it every day because you know it makes you smile. So those are 3 things someone can do to really re-energize their workspace.
Yeah, I love that. Especially now, with so many people working from home, I think that's great advice.
Yeah.
One thing I want to talk about kind of before we get too far off of your background and your book and everything, I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about this idea that you've put out there, this trifecta of mental health. We've touched on some of these subjects, the idea that, having experienced it yourself, you know how to, now empathize and things like that. But I wonder if you just talk about this trifecta a little bit so that we can dissect each of those parts a little.
Sure. So it's funny, when I was trying to create the name for my company, the only thing I could really think of that made sense was a trifecta, because I have 3 different arms of experience that I bring to the table. The first is a lifetime of growing up with my mother, who is bipolar, watching her go up and down, be in and out of hospitals, and just witness the pain of navigating a mental illness. The second is the years that I spent in my corporate environment, helping to create a stigma-free environment, helping to really do things, put things in place that really helped employees feel comfortable with the concept of mental health and conversations. And then the third thing is I was an adopted daughter, so I never in a million years thought I would ever deal with mental illness. But 2 years ago, I found myself dealing with a life event, and I was diagnosed with depression. I never thought that would happen. I thought, I'm pretty resilient, I'll be okay. But, when a life event happens, it can happen to any one of us. Nobody's immune to mental illness. So a tragedy can happen, and you may never have ever had to deal with any type of an imbalance, and you will. And that's exactly what happened to me. So I had to learn how to care for myself. I had to learn how to navigate depression for the first time, and so that was the third arm. So I have like the caregiver, the person dealing with it, and then understanding what to do in the culture to create environments that are better.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, because I think that, I'm trying to explore or poke around the idea of how do we develop empathy, when you kind of can't relate. If you haven't had something like this, how could you really know, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to try and work on these skills and how you might develop empathy. But I do think that, what you're doing in that you share your story and you go out and you let people know, much like we were talking about earlier, that transparency, or that level of transparency within a work culture, and understanding that you were safe to talk to your employer, safe to talk to your coworkers, all these different people. I think that, can certainly help. But I wondered if you had any pointers on developing empathy. I think most people generally want to do good and want to be kind to their coworkers and that sort of thing. But, if you've honestly just not had the experience, do you have any thoughts on how one might sort of learn the empathy?
Yeah, I think you have to be willing to recognize that we all have unconscious bias. So if you have no experience or no exposure to mental illness through a loved one, a family member, or a friend, you might have a belief that mental illness is something that you see in the news that unfortunately shows up in tragedy. And I think the first step is the self-reflection of how do I feel about mental illness? What do I think of it? Is it legit? Is it someone who's crazy? Is it a cop-out? Do I believe that it's a cop-out? People who just need to tough it up. I think in order for us to have empathy, we have to really understand our own unconscious bias and our relationship to mental illness. And if we can understand that and maybe educate ourselves, as a young girl, I was very angry at my mother. She was bipolar. I didn't necessarily know what that meant. All I remembered was she was mean to me. She would either beat me, hug me, or make me feel miserable about myself, right? So I was always at the effects of her behavior, so I couldn't have empathy or compassion. When she passed away and I started thinking about, writing this book and talking about the experience, I actually did research, and I watched a documentary by Richard Fry, where he talks about it was called The Secret Life of the Manic Depressive, and Carrie Fisher was in it. they vividly share what life is like living with mental illness, living with bipolar disorder. And I was able to understand it and really, really feel what they were feeling and understand the illness. And that was when I could start to have compassion for my mother and go, oh, so she wasn't just mean. Gosh, she was really dealing with all of this. So I think to answer the short answer is really educate yourself and, be curious. Try to learn what life is like for someone with, severe depression. Try to learn what schizophrenia is or autism or whatever people are dealing with, so that you can, only then will you be able to really try to have that empathy that we're talking about. You really have to try to understand it.
Well, and I think you make a really good point, or an interesting point anyway, and I think it maybe is curiosity and self-reflection sort of mushed together, is this idea that you didn't even recognize the problem with your mother until she was gone. Like, as a young person, you didn't really know what was going on, just she seemed kind of awful. And so as a result, you reacted, the way you might react, you're defending yourself, you're protecting yourself, whatever you need to do. And so, and it wasn't until you had some space that you were able, and probably some maturity and some age and everything, and you were able to sort of put behind it that, okay, now I can recognize, now I can understand. And so I think this idea of curiosity plus self-reflection, I think for most individuals, even if you don't have it or you can't say that you've experienced any particular, kind of illness yourself, I mean, almost all of us know somebody, even if it's just that crotchety old man down at, the hardware store or whatever. And maybe we don't recognize his problem as being mental health. Maybe we just think he's kind of a jerk. But, a lot of times, and this, I guess, is where the empathy or the compassion comes in, is trying to understand where it is he's coming from and understand that, he's a jerk, but he's actually a jerk because X, Y, and Z is going on in his life and you just don't know about it. And and I think that's an interesting topic.
I think the other thing too, Ryan, we all have to recognize it's just like physical well-being. You always, you reflect on those years when you were in like the top physical shape and then the years that you weren't. I mean, let's think about mental health as being a continuum, not just being you're mentally ill or you're mentally well. It's a continuum, and we're all going to float along that continuum. And we're going to have moments in our life where maybe we go down. I mean, because it's 1 in 5, right? There's going to be something that has us a little bit imbalanced. So I think nobody's immune. Yes, you can look at the extreme cases and go, whoa, but honestly, like we're all really floating along that continuum and anything can happen. It could have us have a little bit of, COVID's a perfect example. People who may have never experienced a mental imbalance might be for the first time,
Well, and it's interesting, if you think about it in a continuum, just as you were saying that, I'm going, okay, well, even a good mood and a bad mood then is, your mental wellness that day, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe it's rainy and crappy outside and you feel down and that's that shift that you're talking about, this sort of continuum. So I think that's a really great way to think about it, because I mean, even in my own head, just as we've been having this conversation, I've been going, it's either on or off. You're either mentally ill or you're one of the fortunate.
Yeah.
And you're right. This idea of this continuum, I think, is a much better thing. And, I'm even thinking in my background, as I mentioned, I've been working remotely in one facet or another for nearly 22 years now. And, in all that time, I mean, I've had lots of ups and downs, I tend to react to bad weather and things like that. So I'll go really down in the winter and up in the summer and, and myself, I'm really kind of a little bit of a roller coaster that way. And so I think it's really interesting that you point that out. That's a great idea or a great thought.
It also goes back to the self-awareness piece. Like one of the things I love to do with my resilience webinar is to get people to pause for a second and ask them how they're doing right now in this moment. Because I think that we go through life so busy that we don't ever even stop and go, how am I feeling today? Is this a good day? Is this a bad day? Not like how you felt yesterday or how you anticipate feeling tomorrow. Like right now, how are you feeling? You feeling pretty good? Is today a good day? Just even acknowledging how you feel, right? That's self-awareness. Yeah. So I think we all really, that's the first step, is just really just getting connected to how we're doing, how we're feeling individually.
Yeah. Well, and I think that could be a critical element too, because I think so many of us sort of, stand around and wait to be put on how we feel. We feel this way because so-and-so acted like this, instead of being, a little bit more reflective and sort of looking internally. That maybe leads me to this question. So I wanted to explore, one of the things that I've identified or has happened a lot in my life, and I know it's a common experience among remote workers, is this sort of isolation, whatever it is that we feel, where you just, even though you're part of a team and you're detached, like you still just kind of don't feel like you're in, or you're not part of the crowd or whatever. And generally speaking, I'm pretty resilient to it, but sometimes you start feeling pretty cruddy and start feeling pretty out there. And so I wonder if you just had any thoughts for people who are maybe now because of COVID, or as a remote worker in general, somebody who's doing it by choice. How would you deal with things like, isolation and that sort of thing? I mean, I'm sure there are cases, you go see a doctor and you get medicated for it. And I'm sure there's some who just, buck up and go be tough. But I imagine there's a lot of people in the middle who just need, who maybe don't even really understand how to contend with what they're feeling.
Yeah. Honestly, it's examples like Zoom. Imagine, back when there was the Spanish flu, they didn't even have something called Zoom. We're very lucky that we do have the video conferencing that allows us to be connected. One of the things I like to promote is the people that you love in your life, your friends, your family, the ones that you can't be with during this time. There's actual studies that a friendly face, someone that you care for and love, connecting with them, even on Zoom or video chat, can actually relieve your stress and your anxiety. So, my advice has always been, and I have to take it myself because I live by myself. I'm a single woman. I've been doing this COVID quarantine for 2 months, so it's no picnic here. But I make the time to connect with my girlfriends, the ones that I really feel good talking to, the ones that make me smile. So really just making sure that you are staying connected to the people that light you up, because that's going to really help you instead of, and unfortunately the screen may not be a hug or their face in person, but it's enough for you to connect. And it's so important that we stay connected during this time. Because we're human beings and we're not designed to be isolated from one another. So at least you can connect through video chat and see their smile and engage with them.
Yeah, the metaphor I've been using during this time as we talk about different touch points, Zoom video conferencing or, any type of video conferencing being one. I always sort of think of, these different touch points as kind of as if we're filling a glass of water, right? Mm-hmm. So a in-person sitting down and having coffee with you is going to be a 10 out of 10 or a full glass of water for me. And maybe a Zoom conference is, 9.5 or 9, or maybe it's more for some people and less for other people, where a text message might be a 2 or a 3 or something like that. And so the idea is that, when we're isolated and we're spending all this time apart, we can kind of pacify ourselves through these different channels, right? By just getting a little text that somebody's thinking about me, that helps. That kind of moves the needle a little bit. And, maybe a nice email or, something that kind of, maybe send me a letter, or something, things kind of move. And, and then same thing with the video conference. You're right. You meet somebody online that you enjoy and it lights you up and you feel a little better. And sure, it's not having coffee. Sure, it's not having dinner with somebody, but it's pretty darn good.
It is.
And so I try and look at things that way, and that, if we're trying to keep ourselves full, the more that we can do these kinds of things and the higher impact the touch point, like a Zoom conversation, the better off we'll be. So I think that's a really good thing to talk about.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about this too. And we sort of touched on it a little bit early, actually, at the beginning of the conversation. You mentioned something about the sort of the fear of mental illness or fear being around it. And you mentioned that, or one of the topics here was that when mental illness is discussed in the media, it's almost always because something's gone wrong. Yeah. Somebody's shot up a school because they had a break, or somebody's done whatever. It's always something horrible. It's never proactive, like we've been discussing so much in this conversation. Right. So considering that, how do people try to, I guess, stem these fears? And can you sort of explain where the fear comes from? Like, why do people feel this way around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like anything you don't know enough information of, right? Like if you don't know how to do something, you imagine it to be 10 times worse than it really is. The media is great for blowing up things and being like, and unfortunately, a lot of incidents, they do tie, to mental imbalance. I think it comes down to looking for the good examples, looking for the positive examples. Like, I live in New Jersey, and there was a famous Eagle football player I don't know if you follow football, but there was an Eagle football player who took himself out of the game because of anxiety. And then like the next day he tweeted about it and talked about it and was like, listen, I deal with anxiety all the time. And it just got the most of me on that particular day. And I had to get out of the game. And it's those examples. It's Lady Gaga talking openly about, taking medication and dealing with her own mental illness. It's those things. We have to look for the good examples because there are so many more high profile people that are talking about it now and trying to humanize it. We have activists like Zach Williams, Robin Williams' son, who's very vocal. I mean, you could look him up. He's talking about mental health all the time. So as much as there's the negative side, there are also very positive examples of people out there. Michael Phelps talks about it with Talkspace. I think it's Talkspace or Headspace, one of the two. He's talking about it. So I think look for the good examples. Don't only be consumed by the negative examples. Like recognize there's a lot of people trying to make change and trying to create a stigma-free culture.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, and maybe just kind of as an extension of that, the role of people who maybe don't have the problems, but much like your situation as a child are experiencing them from somebody else. Yeah. So maybe you go to work and you have a coworker who, is putting off signs that you might go, there's a little something wrong.
Right.
But what is the role of that person? When should they step in? Should they say something? How should they deal with that kind of thing?
So I think, this is a really good point, because I think a lot of us feel like we have to fix everything. Oh my goodness, I think there's something wrong. I can't possibly just go and ask them how they're doing because I can't fix it for them. You don't have to fix it. You could literally just check in with them and ask them how they're doing, because there might not be anybody at home asking them how they're doing. And that little how you're doing, just checking in with them could make all the difference for them. So I would say if you notice somebody struggling with something, just check in and say, how you doing? And just be the ears. You don't have to fix anything. You don't have to, give them any strategies. Just be there and listen to them, and maybe they will articulate how they're doing and share with you. If not, they're going to know that you have just created a safe space with them. And if they ever need to, they'll talk to you. It's so important people keep talking, though. You could play a valuable role in really helping people feel heard.
Yeah. And I think, as we've been talking, I'm hearing sort of this through line, this consistency about communication, that it really is about keeping this conversation open. And you just mentioned this idea of sort of a safe space. And I think, sometimes I hear it in the news and stuff, and safe spaces are kind of getting this rap. People are kind of adding this negative connotation to the idea of a safe space as it pertains to like university or whatever. But what I like about it as a term anyway, is that, really that, when you go to work, it should be a safe place. It should be a place, and not safe in that, of course, that you're not in danger and stuff like that. But if you should also have the ability to sort of, think freely and come as you are. And if you are experiencing a problem, have that conversation and let people know and work with one another that way. And I think employers that encourage that, among their people, like the example you used earlier, where you're talking about they had a sort of a public forum where people could go and sort of share things. I think that's a really valuable way, or a really important way to stand out if you're an employer nowadays.
Yeah. Psychological safety in the workplace is huge, and employers can do that. They can create that psychological safe environment for employees to be themselves. We spend so many hours at work. Why wouldn't we want there to be a place where you could feel comfortable, being your full authentic self, and you didn't have to hide anything,
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So let's talk a little bit quickly as we're starting to get to the end here. I wanted to just talk a little bit about your book, and then what prompted you to write it? What was your hope having published this book?
Yeah. So when I worked at my Fortune 50 company, I had a colleague of mine nominate me to give a TED Talk. I had never given a TED Talk before in my life. And I rarely ever even talked about my story with my mother. It was just my reality. So I didn't really make a big deal about it, but I gave the TED Talk in front of all my peers, like really like bearing my soul, telling them about that experience and how it affected me throughout my life. And what I did with it, I actually share how I took the pain and turned it into making a children's program to give back to kids so that they knew that they were perfect just the way they were, something I missed from my own mother because she was emotionally unavailable. So I gave the TED Talk, and it was just met with such such a wonderful response, a warm response. And I thought if I could make this difference and have people start talking about mental health in just this forum, like, wow, what could I do if I wrote a book? So that was when I put pen to paper, and over a 4-year writing process, I would write my memoir that would really highlight the experiences of growing up with my mom from when I was very little to when I was an adolescent to even as an adult. And take them on that journey with me so they really could understand what that was like, and that I could, humanize mental health and then use it as a vehicle to cause more conversations. Because that was my end game, was if I go first and I tell you about my story and my impact of mental illness, then maybe you're going to be comfortable not hiding in the shadows and maybe sharing your story.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, and I think it just continues down this through line we've had throughout this conversation, this idea that, it takes more conversation, not less conversation. And, as you're talking about it, I'm grateful for you for having put together this children's charity and stuff. Because there are no doubt, many kids that are in that same situation where they have a parent that they just don't understand, why is so-and-so so mean to me? Why is, how come this is the way it is, that kind of thing. And so I think it's really great that there are people trying to help, because it's a challenging situation, no doubt. As we get here sort of to the end, there's a couple of little things I wanted to ask you, just kind of as closers, and maybe to try and offer a little bit of actionable insights to the people who are listening to this. Can you think of something that an employer might do that could sort of, kick off some impactful change, get them shifting their mindset or shifting their culture so that they could start taking better care of the mental health of their distributed teams, sort of maybe in the near term, something that they could do easily or quickly that might just make a better situation for their people?
Yeah. So if you go on my website, actually, michelledickinson.com, I actually have 5 steps that employers can do to cultivate a culture of compassion. And I would say that the first one I'll tell you, and then you can read the rest if you're interested. The first one is to have a clear vision and a remit from the top level of the organization that you're going to create a truly accepting organization that is compassionate and that is stigma free and accepting of people of all abilities. And if you are vocal about that, then your actions will follow through. And whatever you choose to do will be aligned with your policies. You'll have, mental health support that is easy for employees to access. That's another very, very important thing, because when an employee finally gets the courage to call for support, you don't want them to hear that they need to wait 2-3 weeks to get in to see a physician. So you really want robust mental health support for your people so that they get it, and then they can kind of get right back in the game. So I would say definitely have a clear remit, policies that back that, and really robust mental health support for your people.
Great. And then finally, on the other side of that coin, what is something that I or any remote worker, somebody who's working by themselves, at least in part, could do to sort of take care of their mental health needs? So, as the employer is concerned, it's maybe what we were just discussing. Yeah. But how do I, as an individual, sort of, take care of myself? How do I do the right things for me?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about structure, making sure you have structure, making sure that you, the first thing I talk about in my resilience webinar is turn off the news, because I think if we overindulge and we consume ourselves with that is going to play a role in how positive or how empowered we will feel. So really monitor your intake of the media, whatever that looks like for you, even on social media. Make sure that you're exercising, because exercise is so important to get your endorphins going and feeling good. Checking in with the ones that you love and making sure they're okay. Because when you check in on someone that you love, you're also helping yourself out, because you're stepping outside of yourself for a second and really caring for someone else. Those would be some of the things that I would recommend.
I love that. As just sort of a little caveat to that, is there anything that people can do, or are there resources that people could look out for? Like, I don't know if they're trying to understand if what they are suffering from or are feeling is a mental concern, or is there, some sort of platform that people could engage with if they think they might be having a problem?
Yeah. So one of the resources that I always share is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and that's NAMI.org. You can go to the NAMI website. They actually have signs and symptoms of depression. If you're concerned about yourself or your loved one, you can review what those signs and symptoms are. And then they also have, they actually have a COVID resource kit A lot of great resources on their website, and even like support groups, like for family members, for people struggling. But just educate yourself and become aware of really what they have to offer, because it's a great resource.
Yeah, I think that the role of the employer is very critical. As you mentioned, we spend so much time working that, it makes sense that we should take care of ourselves at work. But I think that too, there's a social component, or there's a bit of it that we need to be taking on ourselves and not relying on our employer to make us well. So I appreciate that. So in closing, where can people find out more about you, learn about your book and the work that you're doing?
Sure. You can find my book on Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com. My website, I'd love to hear from people. If you're interested in my resilience webinar for your people, my website is michelledickinson.com. I'd love to hear from people. So reach out to me through my website. Yeah. That's awesome. Perfect. Well, yeah. And we'll put all those links in the show notes and all that stuff. So we'll make sure that people can get in touch and do swing by your website. If you're an employer and you want to see the other 4 items on this, how to make yourself culturally competent kind of thing. I think that'd be a really great resource for a lot of our, managers and directors that are listening in. So great. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I think there's some really great insights in there that I think will serve our audience well. And thanks so much. Appreciate it. You're so welcome. Thanks for having me, Ryan. Thanks. I don't owe you anything. I don't know you.